Early this year, the Georgetown University law student was shut out by the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, chaired by San Diego's Darrell Issa. She was called a prostitute by talk show host Rush Limbaugh for wanting insurance companies to cover contraception. Now, after speaking at the Democratic National Convention, she has been touring the country speaking about reproductive rights and voting. Sandra Fluke, welcome to Evening Edition.
Thank you.
You've been touring the country as a speaker for Planned Parenthood, in part because you think of the voting, it's voting right now, and the importance of how that is to reproductive rights. You say they're in danger. What kind of danger do you think they're in?
Well, I think we've seen an unprecedented number of attacks, bills in the House of Representatives, specifically over the last 2 years, that have targeted limiting women's access to the health care that they need. And I think it's really important that folks understand that that's not just about abortion. Of course, our right to safe and legal abortions is under attack, but we've seen bills to defund Planned Parenthood. And what that really means is taking away access to breast cancer screenings and cervical cancer screenings and things like contraception. So we're seeing this across the board on women's health. It's not even just about abortion.
In the news recently, along with this, we've heard Congressman Todd Aiken's remarks where he's talked about legitimate rape. Those are his words. And U.S. Senate candidate Richard Murdoch recently said that pregnancy by rape is, quote, again, intended by God. Do you think that these statements actually have any effects on voters?
Well, what I focus more on is not the statement, but the policy behind it. I think that those statements reveal how these elected officials and these officials running for Congress would legislate on women's health. You know, we saw in the last 2 years a bill to make distinctions between which survivors of rape were, quote unquote, legitimate enough to deserve access to the abortion care that they may need. And 80% of the American public believes that someone who's experienced a rape should have a choice about whether or not to carry that pregnancy to term. So that kind of a bill is very out of step with the American public, and it's really shocking to realize that Representative Ryan co-sponsored it and that Mr. Bilbray here in San Diego and Mr. Issa also voted for it.
What about the Republican Party in general? Do they have a single message that you've heard, even though 80%, as you said, in the U.S. support the right to abortion after a rape?
Right.
Do you think the Republican Party has a different message in general? Are these just renegades on the side?
Well, what I think has happened is, unfortunately, some very extreme voices have been able to seize leadership in the Republican Party, and some of the more moderate voices are really kowtowing to them right now. And so that's why I think this November is a very important election for us all to send a message that this type of extreme rhetoric about women's health and these extreme bills attacking women's health are not what the public is looking for from any political party.
Let's talk about the public. What has your observation been of the attitudes on, let's say, college-age women's or campuses towards women's issues, toward reproductive rights? Is it a case where they're like, they've had it, these are people who have never had to struggle for it, so they don't think about it much, or is it something different?
I've heard from women of all ages over the last 9 months that what they're seeing this year and what we're learning about has been happening in our legislatures is really shocking. And many of us are becoming more aware and are waking up, and that includes men as well. I hear from a lot of men. So young women also are really surprised that things like affordable access to contraception are up for debate, and that we are actually seeing bills that would criminalize some forms of contraception. So they're surprised and they're concerned and they're getting active and they're getting out the vote, which is the most important thing.
Take us back to February of this year when you were refused, you were going to testify at the committee and you were refused. What were you going to say, and did they give you an explanation as to why you weren't allowed to testify?
Yes, so as you mentioned, that was Mr. Issa's committee, and the reason that he gave for me not testifying was that my testimony was not appropriate. And as a result, it meant that that committee didn't hear from any women on the first panel, and they heard from no one whatsoever who testified about how the Affordable Care Act's contraception insurance coverage policy would impact women. And that's really what any of our elected officials should be thinking about is how are citizens going to be impacted by the policy that's under consideration.
And that's something you'll be speaking about tomorrow at the rally. We'll have more information on
Yes.
that. We are out of time. Sandra Fluke, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.